So back in Java 5, when Java added support for generic types to lists, it was a win in every way. Your code was shorter, your code was more readable, your code was more type safe, and your performance was the same. But at the same time, Java added something called autoboxing. Autoboxing is not a win in every way, but rather it's a trade-off. So Java maintains a distinction between objects and primitive. Objects start with an uppercase letter, so string, capital S, is an object. But int, lowercase I, is a primitive. The difference is whether they're implemented with pointers or they're stored directly. So an array of ints is an array of numbers, whereas an array of strings is really an array of pointers to strings or references to strings. Well, list, and later on we'll see map, expect object types, not primitive types. So you cannot put an int into a list. But what if you want a list of numbers? So Java has always had these wrapper types, which are basically objects that contain numbers. Integer capital I for int, double capital D for lowercase d double, and so forth. In Java 5, when they added support for generic types, they also added support for autoboxing, which means it converts automatically. If you assign an int to a variable this is declared as type integer, it converts, and vice versa. If you assign an integer to something of type int, it converts automatically. But there's a cost associated with that. So in the pre-Java 5 days, before autoboxing, if you wanted a list and you had an int, you had to explicitly convert the int to an integer and put the integer into the list. And then when you took something back out of the list, you had to treat it as an integer and do the calculation to turn it into an int. This was a big pain in the backside, and everybody complained about it, and it just made your code long and tedious. So in Java 5, it said, well, you know, if you declare it to be of type integer, and some calculation returns an int, it's okay. I'll convert automatically behind the scenes. And if you try to assign it to an int, even though the entries in the list are of type integer, the box type, the wrapper type, it'll convert automatically. This is very convenient, but there is a cost. In particular, suppose you have an array of ints, lowercase I, and you're doing a whole bunch of calculations where you're very frequently reading a number out of the array, multiplying it or doing some conversion and storing it back into the array at the same place. And then you do the same thing with the list of integer. The version with the list of integer will be slower because every time you read something out of the array, it's taking the integer and getting the int out of it. And every time you're storing something back into the list, you're taking the int, allocating a new integer, and putting it back in again. Most of the time, it doesn't matter. Most of the time, you store things in the list, and you read things from the list, and you don't kind of replace the entries in the list. But occasionally you do, so you should realize that generic types in general were a win. But autoboxing in specific is a trade-off. It gains you something in convenience, but occasionally it can cost you something in performance.